Imagine a city, a real marvel that had stood like this unwavering bastion for well over 1,000 years,
Hmm.
a place so tough, so vital that people just thought it was impregnable.
Right.
This was truly where East met West, a vibrant heart of culture, trade, everything.
Yeah, real melting pot.
No, picture that same incredible city just suddenly brought to its knees, a huge, cataclysmic event that didn't just change its future, but basically reshaped the whole world.
It's hard to really overstate the impact, isn't it? That
Oh,
single
yeah.
moment.
That
It
is,
wasn't just a city falling. It was like a hinge point in history.
yeah.
Sent ripples out for centuries,
Yeah.
affecting, well, everything from military tactics, imperial dreams,
Right.
to the very core of European culture, how
Yeah.
scholarship developed. I mean, it's an event that still echoes today, really.
Absolutely. And that is exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into the fall of Constantinople on May 29th, 1453.
A date etched in history.
It really is. Our mission here is to unpack the whole gripping story of this pivotal moment. We want to explore the strategic genius behind its fall, the desperate, incredibly brave defense by its people,
Hmm.
and the huge, complex legacy, the end of an ancient empire, the dawn of a completely new era.
And to guide us through this, we got some amazing sources. We're relying on a really rich stack of original accounts.
Yeah, tell us about those.
Well, we have direct testimonies from no fewer than 15 eyewitnesses. Think about that, 15 different perspectives.
Wow.
Yeah, a mix of Christians and Turks, which gives us these incredibly vivid firsthand views.
Like who specifically?
Well, there's the Greek George Francis, who was actually the emperor's chancellor right there in the inner circle.
Okay.
Then there's the Venetian physician, Niccolo Barbaro, who kept this meticulous journal, almost a day-by-day account of the siege.
Invaluable.
Totally. And even someone like the Serbian Constantine Mihailovic, who actually fought on the Ottoman side. So you get that perspective, too.
Fascinating, seeing it from both sides.
Exactly. And this incredible eyewitness material, it's backed up by about 20 contemporary non-eyewitness accounts, too.
So people writing about it shortly after.
Crucial insights from Byzantine Greek historians like Ducas and Laonikos Chalkokondyles, various Italian chroniclers, even figures like Pope Pius II weighing in.
So you get the immediate reaction, the sort of the broader interpretation.
Precisely. And what's really illuminating, is that these varied sources sometimes offer conflicting details.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right?
Not at all. It actually lets us build a more nuanced picture, like a mosaic, understanding how things unfolded from different angles, rather than just accepting one single story. It's about piecing together the truth as best we can.
And what a story it is. To really grasp the scale of this whole thing, we need to set the stage first.
Yeah, context is everything.
For almost 1,500 years, this incredible city, often called New Rome, was the undisputed capital of the Byzantine Empire.
The continuation of Rome, essentially.
Exactly. This wasn't just any empire. It was the direct, living continuation of the Roman Empire, stretching all the way back to 330 AD when Constantine the Great consecrated it. He basically set it up as a second imperial capital.
Just think about that time frame. 1,000, almost 1,500 years of continuous imperial power centered there. It's mind-boggling.
Its sheer ability to endure is just astounding.
It really is. This city had this legendary reputation for surviving sieges. I mean, throughout its long history, it faced countless attempts. Goths, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, you name it.
So it had seen it all before.
Pretty much. In fact, before 1453, it had only actually been captured once.
Ah, right, the Fourth Crusade.
Exactly. The infamous sack of Constantinople in 1204. That was a devastating blow. Betrayal by fellow Christians that really shocked the world. But even after that, the city somehow managed to recover, although it was definitely weakened.
And a massive part of that incredible resilience was down to its defenses, right? The legendary Theodosian walls.
Oh, absolutely crucial. These weren't just walls. They were a masterpiece of military engineering. Probably the most advanced defensive system of their time.
For how long did they protect the city?
For an incredible 800 years. This complex system, multiple layers, ditches, towers, it just held firm. Their reputation for being invulnerable was so deep-seated that when they were finally breached in 1453, it caused this immense shock and disbelief across both Christendom and the Islamic world. People thought it was impossible.
But by 1453, the empire itself, it wasn't what it used to be.
No, sadly not. It was really a shadow of its former self. That terrible 1204 sack had left this unstable Latin state ruling for a while.
Right.
And even when the Byzantines managed to recapture the city in 1261 and put the Palaiologos dynasty back on the throne, The empire was already fragmented. It never truly recovered its old glory or stability.
It had broken up.
Yeah, it had splintered into smaller successor states like Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond, all sort of vying for influence.
So it sounds like the empire was just constantly fighting to survive, battling on multiple fronts.
Precisely. Centuries of non-stop, exhausting conflict against the Latins, Serbs, Bulgarians, and increasingly, the rising power of the Ottoman Turks.
A relentless pressure.
Absolutely. And then you add the devastating impact of the Black Death between 1346 and 1349.
Oh, right. That hit Constantinople hard.
Massively. Some estimates say it wiped out almost half the city's inhabitants.
Yeah.
So that left the city really depopulated and the empire just utterly exhausted, militarily, economically.
Wow.
By 1453, you get these contemporary descriptions that paint a pretty grim picture. Constantinople was essentially like a series of walled villages.
Inside the main walls.
Yeah, separated by vast empty fields, all contained within those ancient Theodosian walls. It was like a sprawling skeleton of its former self.
That's a powerful image. A city that once had maybe 1 million people, now just a fraction of that. Empty spaces where markets and palaces used to be.
Exactly. Its huge borders had shrunk dramatically. By 1453, the empire was basically just a few square kilometers right around the city itself, a few islands nearby, and the Peloponnese in southern Greece, which still had some cultural importance around Mistras.
And Trebizond.
And the independent empire of Trebizond, yeah, that distant outpost on the Black Sea coast, that was pretty much it.
And this shrinking, weakened empire faced this massive threat, the Ottoman Turks.
An undeniable existential threat. The Ottomans had been steadily, relentlessly expanding for over a century. They'd made their first big move into Europe back in 1352, got a foothold on the Bosporus, and then pushed into Thrace by 1361. So they'd effectively been encircling Constantinople for decades.
So for the Ottomans, this was the ultimate prize.
Absolutely. Controlling Constantinople wasn't just about taking another city, it was the strategic prize. The most significant geopolitical crossroads in the world, linking Europe and Asia, controlling vital trade routes.
And the symbolism.
Huge symbolism, imperial power. For the Ottomans, it was the key to their grand ambitions, this jewel they'd wanted for so long, sitting right in the middle of their growing empire.
Which brings us neatly to the key players in this clash, starting with Sultan Mehmed II, the ambitious young conqueror.
Remarkably young, just 19 years old when he succeeded his father, Murad II, in 1451.
19.
Yeah. And from the moment he took the throne, his focus, almost his obsession, was Constantinople.
But the Europeans didn't see it coming.
It's quite astonishing looking back. So many European courts just completely misjudged him. They underestimated this young ruler, thought his inexperience would cause problems for the Ottomans, maybe lead to internal fighting.
So they weren't worried.
Some European leaders actually celebrated his ascension. They thought he'd be easier to deal with than his father. A huge, catastrophic miscalculation.
Wow. Talk about underestimating your opponent. And Mehmed didn't waste any time showing his hand.
Not at all. His true intentions became crystal clear very quickly. In early 1452, less than a year into his reign, he started building a brand new fortress, Rumeli Hisarü.
Where was that?
On the European side of the Bosphorus, right across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian side.
Squeezing the strait.
Exactly. And this new stronghold got this really ominous name, Boğazgesen, which in Turkish can mean strait blocker, but also, chillingly, throat cutter.
Yikes. Not subtle.
No, it was an unmistakable message, designed to give him complete control over all sea traffic through the Bosphorus, basically strangling Constantinople's access to the Black Sea, vital for trade and potential help.
And his strategic planning went beyond just the fortress.
Oh, yes. Mehmed knew he had to cut off any possible reinforcements for the Byzantines. He ordered his general, Turakan Beg, to park a large garrison down in the Peloponnese.
Why there?
To stop Emperor Constantine Izi's brothers, they ruled semi-independently down there from sending any aid north to the city. Smart move.
Covering all the bases.
And at the same time, another commander, Karaka Pasha, was tasked with preparing the roads from the Ottoman capital, Adrianople, all the way to Constantinople.
Just making sure the army could get there easily.
More than that, this wasn't just road repair. They were widening paths, reinforcing bridges, making sure they could handle the immense weight and size of his new secret weapon. Massive artillery.
Ah, the cannons.
Exactly. 50 skilled carpenters, 200 artisans, deployed just for this huge logistical task. The level of planning for a teenager is, frankly, pretty remarkable.
It really shows incredible foresight and obsession. He wasn't just a strategist either. He knew how to motivate his troops.
Right. The Greek historian Michael Critobulus, who lived through it all, recorded Mehmed giving this rousing speech to his soldiers before the siege, reminding them of their ancestors' struggle, of their victories, the kingdom they inherited.
Firing them up.
Yeah, painting this vivid picture of glory, rewards, framing it as a holy conquest, stirring up their loyalty, ambition, religious fervor. He knew what buttons to push.
Okay, let's switch focus. The other main player, Emperor Constantine Paleologos, the defender.
The beleaguered defender. Unlike those European courts, Constantine immediately saw the danger. He knew Mehmed wasn't just messing around. This was it, the final showdown.
So what was his first move?
His most urgent step was to desperately plead for Western aid, a call that, tragically, mostly fell on deaf ears.
Why? What was the problem?
He was up against this bitter, deep-seated legacy of centuries of bad blood between the Eastern and Western churches.
The Great Schism and all that.
Exactly. The deep theological and cultural gap from 1054, the Pope in Rome demanding authority over the Eastern Church, and maybe most painfully, the memory of past attempts at church union.
Like when?
Efforts in 1274 and again in 1439 were basically deals to get Western military help. But they were met with fierce opposition in Constantinople itself.
Why? Didn't they need the help?
They did, but the resistance was fueled by widespread anti-unionist propaganda, this latent ethnic hatred between Greeks and Italians stemming from things like the 1182 massacre of the Latins.
Right.
And of course, the unforgivable betrayal of the 1204 sack by Western crusaders. The idea of submitting to Rome was just unthinkable for many Byzantines. It felt like trading one master for another.
So the attempt at union didn't really work?
It was ratified on paper, but it failed to bridge the gap, leaving Pope Nicholas V and the Roman Church pretty frustrated. And while Pope Nicholas genuinely wanted to help Constantine,
his influence wasn't that strong.
Exactly. His actual power over Western rulers was much weaker than the Byzantines desperately hoped. Many European powers were just exhausted, broke, or tied up with their own problems.
Like what?
France and England were still recovering from the 100 Years' War. Spain was busy with the Reconquista. The Holy Roman Empire was tangled in internal politics. And key players in Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland, had suffered a huge defeat at the Battle of Varna only a decade earlier in 1444.
So they were in no shape for a crusade.
Absolutely not. So despite Constantine's desperate pleas, a big united Western rescue mission just wasn't going to happen.
But some help did arrive.
Some did, yeah. Individuals and a few Italian city-states sent what they could, though it was really just a drop in the ocean against the coming Ottoman tide. Cardinal Isidore, paid for by the Pope, showed up in 1452 with only 200 archers.
Not exactly an army.
No. But the most significant arrival was in January 1453. Giovanni Giustiniani.
Ah, the Genoese commander.
Yes, an accomplished soldier from Genoa, a renowned expert in defending walled cities. He brought 400 men from Genoa and another 300 from Genoese Chios, 700 experienced fighters in total.
And Constantine recognized his value.
Immediately. His reputation was so strong that Emperor Constantine put him in overall command of the crucial land walls. Shows how desperate the emperor was, but also Giustiniani's expertise.
Any others?
Some Venetian ship captains already in the Golden Horn offered their services, about a dozen ships and their crews. Pope Nicholas sent 3 supply ships, though they arrived very late in the siege. And we know Gabriele Orsini del Balzo from Naples came with about 200 Neapolitan archers. So, bits and pieces, but not nearly enough.
And even that small amount was undermined.
Yeah, deeply demoralizing setbacks. 7 Italian ships, carrying about 700 men, the same number Giustiniani brought, slipped out of the harbor almost as soon as Giustiniani arrived. They'd sworn oaths to defend the city, but clearly saw which way the wind was blowing.
Ouch. And Constantine's diplomacy failed too.
Completely. His early attempts to appease Mehmed with gifts and talks ended brutally. Mehmed just had his ambassadors executed, a clear message. No compromise possible.
Chilling. Okay, let's talk numbers. The forces involved. What was Mehmed II actually bringing to the fight?
The scale is just staggering. On the Ottoman side, modern, more conservative estimates put Mehmed's total army at somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers.
A massive force for the time.
Huge. And within that, he had between 5,000 and 10,000 elite janissaries.
The elite troops.
Absolutely. Highly trained, fiercely loyal infantry, originally recruited from Christian boys, taken through the Descharme system, converted, raised to be this unparalleled fighting force.
Yeah.
Extremely disciplined.
And weren't there Christians fighting for the Ottomans too?
Yes, that's a really striking point, often overlooked. Thousands of Christian troops were part of the Ottoman army. For example, about 1,500 Serbian cavalry were forced to serve by their ruler, Ora Brankovic, who was an Ottoman vassal.
And didn't he also help Constantinople?
Ironically, yes. Brankovic had only recently sent a lot of money to Constantinople to help repair the walls. So you've got Christians fighting on both sides, caught in this complex web of power and loyalty.
A stark reminder of the brutal realities. And the Ottomans weren't just about numbers, right? They brought new tech.
Exactly. The cannons. They deployed somewhere between 12 and 62 cannons, a truly formidable artillery train for the 15th century. Many were built by skilled Turkish engineers like Saruka.
But the big one was Basilica.
Ah, yes, Basilica, the star of the show, the weapon that terrified the defenders. This massive cannon, 27 feet long, built by this Hungarian or maybe German engineer named Orban.
What could it do?
It was designed to hurl these enormous 600-pound stone balls over a mile. Just the sight of it being dragged into position by teams of oxen and hundreds of men must have been terrifying for the Byzantines.
But it wasn't perfect?
No, not at all. Like a lot of early tech, it had major drawbacks. It took a reported 3 hours to reload after each shot.
3 hours.
Yeah. Cannonballs were incredibly scarce. And there's a disputed story that it actually collapsed under its own recoil after only 6 weeks. Shows how fragile this early gunpowder tech could be.
But the psychological impact.
Immense.
Yeah.
Even with its limitations. And getting it there was a feat in itself. Transported all the way from Edirne, hundreds of miles, needed 60 oxen and over 400 men just to move it and clear the path.
What about their navy? Constantinople's on the water?
They had a substantial fleet, too. Estimates range widely, from 110 up to maybe 430 ships. A more realistic modern guess is around 110 vessels, including 70 large galleys and 75 horse transports for landings. Enough to control the seas around the city.
And where did they position the main army?
They set up camp strategically south of the Golden Horn. Mehmed himself positioned his elite janissaries and the heaviest cannons right near the Mezzotetian.
Why there?
That central section of the land walls had always been seen as the weakest point. Plus, the Ottomans were masters of siege warfare honed over centuries. They even used surprisingly modern sanitation methods, burning corpses, checking water sources to prevent disease, which often wiped out besieging armies. Shows Mehmed's strategic thinking again.
Okay, now let's look at the Byzantine side. What did they have to defend the city?
Their strength, or really their lack of it, is heartbreaking. The defending army was tiny, tragically small.
How small?
Total numbers were maybe 7,000 to 10,000 professional soldiers. And of those, only about 2,000 were foreigners, like Justiniani's men.
What about the locals?
George Francis, the emperor's chancellor, recorded this incredibly low figure. Only 4,773 native Greek men capable of bearing arms. Plus maybe 3,000 foreign volunteers, so fewer than 8,000 men in total.
To defend how much wall?
A massive 20-kilometer perimeter, 5.5 kilometers of land walls, 7 kilometers of sea walls along the Golden Horn, another 7 kilometers along the Sea of Marmara.
That's incredibly thin.
Spread incredibly thin. And the city's population itself was way down, likely under 50,000, even with refugees. Just a fraction of its former glory.
But there were acts of loyalty.
Absolutely. Incredible acts of loyalty and sacrifice. Like the Turkish commander Dorgano and his men who were working for the emperor, they stayed fiercely loyal and died defending the city. Highlights the complex loyalties, doesn't it?
It does.
Justiniani's Genoese corps was well-trained and no doubt. But most defenders were just armed civilians, sailors, even monks pressed into service.
Still, the citizens played a big role.
A crucial, tireless role. They repaired the walls constantly under bombardment, stood guard, distributed the scarce food, even melted down precious church treasures into coins to pay the foreign soldiers. A collective, desperate will to survive.
What about their navy?
Equally meager. A small fleet, just 26 ships against the huge Ottoman armada.
But the fortifications were still good.
Yes, that was their main hope. Those 20 kilometers of walls, especially the Theodosian walls, had been recently repaired and were considered to be in good shape. That gave the defenders a sliver of hope they could hold out maybe until Western aid miraculously arrived.
And they had the chain, right?
Yes, the Great Chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn. A crucial defensive element floating on logs, strong enough to stop enemy ships getting into the harbor.
Learn from past mistakes.
Definitely. Based directly on the bitter lesson of 1204, when the Crusaders got around the land walls by breaching the Golden Horn seawall, the Byzantines knew that chain was vital.
How were the defenders deployed?
Emperor Constantine and his core Greek troops guarded the Mezzotetian, the central weakest section. Justiniani, the Genoese expert, was initially positioned north, but later shifted his forces to reinforce Constantine there. Various Venetian and Genoese groups manned other sections and the sea walls. They even had 2 small tactical reserves inside the city, ready to rush to critical spots.
Did the Byzantines have cannons too?
They did, but they were far less effective than the Ottomans. Smaller, fewer. And the recoil often damaged their own walls. So they were kind of a double-edged sword, really perilous to use.
So despite these overwhelming odds, some historians say the fall wasn't inevitable.
That's the argument. Many contemporaries considered Constantinople the best defended city in Europe at the time. It raises that key question. If it was so strong with such a history of resilience, how did it finally fall? What went wrong?
Which leads us right into how the siege actually played out. The Ottoman tactics, the turning points.
Exactly. So, at the very start, Mehmed, always practical, sent troops to quickly take out the remaining small Byzantine strongholds outside the main city walls.
Mopping up resistance.
Yeah. The fortress of Therapia on the Bosphorus, a little castle near Studius by the Sea of Marmara, they fell within days, eliminated any potential threats from the outside, and his admiral, Baltoglu, likely seized the Prince's Islands in the Sea of Marmara around then, too, securing the southern approaches.
And then the bombardment started.
Oh, yes. The relentless cannonade. Mehmed's huge cannons pounded the Theodosian walls day after day, week after week. The noise alone must have been utterly terrifying, a constant assault on the defenders' nerves.
But the walls held up initially.
Surprisingly well, yes. That's often underestimated. Despite the cannon's power, they were imprecise, and the reload time was agonizingly slow. Remember, Basilica's 3 hours.
Right.
That actually gave the Byzantine defenders time to repair most of the damage after each hit. Their walls, even weakened, were incredibly resilient. They tirelessly filled the breaches with timber, rubble, earth, mitigating the immediate impact for weeks.
Okay, but then came a setback for the Ottomans in the Golden Horn.
Yes, a major one initially. The Ottoman fleet under Admiral Baltoglu was completely blocked by that great chain across the entrance. The Byzantine naval defense was working perfectly. Must have really frustrated Mehmed.
And then the Christian ships broke through.
Yeah, on April 20th. A small but hugely significant flotilla, 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese, 1 Byzantine grain transport managed to fight their way through the Ottoman blockade.
That must have lifted spirits inside.
Well, massively. A huge morale boost for the defenders, a real glimmer of hope, and a huge public embarrassment for the Sultan.
What happened to the Ottoman admiral?
Baltoglu. He reportedly got injured in the eye during the fight. Worse, he was stripped of all his wealth and property and publicly whipped 100 times on Mehmed's orders, a stark warning to other commanders. Failure wasn't an option.
Wow. That must have sent a chill through the Ottoman camp.
Definitely. But Mehmed's response to this naval failure was just audacious, pure engineering genius and military cunning.
What did he do?
Faced with the chain he couldn't break, he ordered the construction of an incredible road of greased logs, nearly a mile long, across the landmass of Galata, north of the Golden Horn, behind the Genoese colony there.
A road of logs.
To do what? On April 22nd, he literally dragged his ships overland, using manpower, oxen, right into the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the chain.
He dragged ships over land.
Yes. It stunned the defenders, an absolute game changer.
Yeah.
It didn't just bypass their naval defenses, it threatened supplies from the supposedly neutral Genoese colony of Pera nearby, and totally demoralized the Byzantines. Their inner harbor was now vulnerable.
That's incredible. A masterstroke. Did the Byzantines try to counter?
They did. They tried to destroy the Ottoman ships now inside the Golden Horn using fire ships on April 28th. But sadly, it failed. Lots of Christian casualties, captured men.
And Mehmed retaliated.
Horrifically, 40 captured Italians who'd escaped their sinking ships were impaled on stakes, in full view of the city walls. A brutal act of psychological warfare.
How did the Byzantines respond to that?
In grim kind, they executed 260 Ottoman prisoners they held right there on the walls one by one. A desperate show of defiance.
So the violence just kept escalating.
Terribly. And this whole episode forced the Byzantines to divert their already scarce troops to defend the now vulnerable Golden Horn sea walls, stretching their lines even thinner. A terrible position.
Meanwhile, back on the land walls, what was happening?
The Ottoman army launched several big frontal assaults throughout the siege, but they were costly failures, met with fierce resistance.
The Janissaries were involved?
Oh, yes. The Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro wrote in his diary about their fearless determination, how they had almost fanatically rushed forward, even willing to die just to retrieve their fallen comrades under fire. It wasn't just fighting. It was about honor, reputation, even in the face of heavy losses.
So direct assaults weren't working well. What did the Ottomans try next?
They shifted tactics again. From mid-May to May 25th, they tried tunneling, constructing this complex network of tunnels to try and mine underneath the walls and collapse them.
Underground warfare.
Exactly. A lot of the miners, the sappers, were Serbian, working under Zagan Pasha. Dark, dangerous, claustrophobic work.
Did the Byzantines figure it out?
They did, thanks to an engineer named Johannes Grant, possibly Scottish. He was apparently a master of countermining. He directed Byzantine troops to dig intercept tunnels. They successfully found and destroyed Ottoman tunnels on May 16th, 21st, 23rd, 25th, using Greek fire, even fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness underground.
Wow.
And then a crucial breakthrough. On May 23rd, they captured 2 Turkish officers, tortured them, and got the locations of all the remaining tunnels. Destroyed the lot. A huge defensive win for the Byzantines, forcing the Ottomans to give up on mining.
So despite these setbacks for the Ottomans, Mehmed kept going.
Utterly determined. On May 21st, he actually sent an ambassador into the city with an offer.
To surrender.
Yeah. Lift the siege if they surrendered. He promised the emperor and everyone else could leave safely with their possessions, even offered to make Constantine governor of the Peloponnese. Guaranteed safety for anyone who stayed. It sounds tempting for a city on the brink.
But Constantine refused.
Completely. An incredible display of defiance. He'd pay higher tributes, recognize Ottoman conquests, sure, but surrender the city? Never. His famous response basically was, surrendering the city isn't up to me or anyone else. We've all decided to die here freely without worrying about our lives.
Powerful words. What did Mehmed do then?
Faced with that unwavering refusal, he held a final critical council of war.
What were the options?
His most experienced advisor, the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, argued strongly to abandon the siege. He pointed to the setbacks, the heavy losses, the difficulty of breaching the walls, advocated caution.
But others disagreed.
Yes. Zagan Pasha, a younger, more aggressive commander, pushed hard for an immediate all-out attack, argued the Byzantines were exhausted, right on the verge of collapse.
And Mehmed?
He sided with Zagan Pasha. Believing the defenders were sufficiently weakened by the constant bombardment and psychological pressure, he decided. One final, massive, all-out offensive. No retreat, no surrender, only conquest.
And this final period, leading up to the assault, it was marked by bad omens for the Byzantines.
Yeah, really eerie stuff, interpreted as prophecies of doom. On May 22nd, there was a partial lunar eclipse. That terrified the already stressed inhabitants. For deeply religious people, it looked like a sign of God's displeasure, impending disaster.
And wasn't there something else?
4 days later, even stranger, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, very unusual for May, covering the city in this unsettling gloom. Then reports of a strange, flickering light seen playing around the massive dome of the Hagia Sophia.
What did people think it was?
Some thought it was the Holy Spirit, the city's divine protector, literally leaving. Others, clinging to hope, thought maybe it was the campfires of that long-awaited Christian relief army finally arriving.
Do you know what it actually was?
Historians now think these might have been local atmospheric effects, maybe even linked to a big volcanic eruption around 145253. But at the time, the psychological impact was huge. Even Mehmed was reportedly moved by these signs, maybe seeing them as confirming his destiny or just recognizing how they demoralized the defenders. The air was thick with dread.
So the stage was set. The final storm was coming.
Preparations began on the evening of May 26th. Intense, relentless work for 36 straight hours, mobilizing the entire army, checking equipment, final orders. Then the soldiers got a brief day for prayer and rest on May 28th. The quiet before the storm.
And any last hope for the defenders vanished?
Utterly. On May 27th, a small Venetian fleet, the last desperate hope, finally showed up, only to deliver the crushing news. No large Venetian relief fleet was coming. They were completely alone.
What was the mood like inside the city then?
On May 28th, knowing the end was near, they held mass religious processions. Citizens, soldiers, clergy, both Latin and Greek, walking the streets with icons, praying for a miracle. And that evening, a truly solemn, emotional last service, Vespers, in the Hagia Sophia, attended by Emperor Constantine himself. Representatives of both Latin and Greek churches finally united in their desperation. A deeply poignant moment.
Meanwhile, outside, the Ottomans were ready.
Primed for ferocity. By then, they'd fired an estimated 5,000 cannon shots at the walls, consumed something like 55,000 pounds of gunpowder. Just imagine the scale. Throughout the Ottoman camp, criers, horns, trumpets, rousing the Ghazis, the warriors, for the final assault. Anticipation, grim determination.
And then, the morning of May 29th, 1453.
After midnight, the assault began. Piercing sounds of Ottoman trumpets, drums, wave after wave of troops hit the walls.
Who went first?
First, the Christian auxiliaries and the irregular Azaps, basically cannon fodder, meant to exhaust the defenders, find weak spots. Then came the Anatolian Turkmen forces, pushing hard against the strained Byzantine lines, focusing on that damaged Blachernay section in the northwest.
Did the defenders hold them back?
They did, initially, pushed back those first waves, but at a terrible cost in lives and exhaustion. But then came the final wave, the elite Janissaries.
The decisive blow.
Relentless, disciplined, utterly ferocious. This was where the sheer organized power of the Ottoman army just overwhelmed the exhausted, outnumbered Byzantines.
And this is when Giustiniani was wounded.
Exactly. At this critical moment, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese general so crucial to the defense, was grievously wounded. Arrow, cannon splinter, accounts vary, but it's severe.
And his leaving the wall caused panic.
Immediate, widespread panic. His evacuation from the ramparts broke the defenders' morale. Now, it's worth noting some hostile sources claim he faked injury out of fear. Genoa denied this vehemently later. But whatever the truth, his removal was catastrophic for leadership. He died a few days later from his wounds.
So Constantine was left alone.
Pretty much. With Giustiniani gone, his Genoese troops demoralized and retreating, Emperor Constantine is silent, and his handful of remaining loyal men faced the full force of the Janissaries. They fought with incredible bravery, but it was hopeless.
The walls were breached.
Overwhelmed at several points. The Janissaries, famously led by a giant named Ulubatli Hassan, who was first over the top, broke through. The city's defenses were breached. It was over.
What happened to the defenders then?
Chaos. Many Greek soldiers, seeing the city was lost, understandably fled to try and protect their families. Venetians retreated towards their ships, hoping to escape. Some Genoese made it across to Galata. Others just surrendered or, in despair, took their own lives.
And Constantine himself.
The stories are legendary, almost mythical. They say he cast off his purple imperial cloak, his insignia, and led one final desperate charge into the oncoming Ottomans. Died fighting in the streets. His body was never definitively identified. A truly tragic end for the last Roman emperor.
Did anyone manage to escape?
A few. Some civilians, along with retreating Venetians and Genoese, got away on ships, just barely evading the Ottoman navy, which took full control of the Golden Horn by midday.
What happened as the Ottomans poured in?
The army fanned out along the main streets, past the old forums towards the Church of the Holy Apostles. Though Mehmed actually sent an advance guard to protect some key buildings, he wanted a functioning capital, not total ruin. The Catalan defenders reportedly held their section of the wall to the bitter end, among the last to fall.
And the Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart.
A tragic scene. A huge crowd of civilians had packed inside, desperately hoping for divine protection. But the massive bronze doors were broken down.
What happened inside?
Troops rushed in, started separating the congregation, ruthlessly sorting them, prioritizing those who'd be valuable in the slave markets.
Did Mehmed go there?
He did, later that day. Reportedly marveled at its scale, its beauty. There's that famous story where he saw one of his soldiers trying to smash the marble floor.
Right, he stopped him.
Cut him down with his sword, supposedly declaring, "Be satisfied with the booty and the captives. The buildings of the city belong to me." Shows his pragmatic vision rebuilt, not utterly destroy.
And the church itself?
Immediately converted into a mosque. Christian symbols covered or removed. Though, interestingly, he allowed the Greek Orthodox church structure to remain intact, even appointed a new patriarch, Gennadius Scalarius. A move to control his new Christian subjects, not annihilate their faith entirely.
The immediate aftermath sounds incredibly bloody.
It was. Ottoman casualties, though unknown, must have been severe given the fierce fighting. But the accounts from the defenders are horrific. Barbaro, the Venetian diarist, wrote about blood flowing through the streets like rainwater, bodies floating in the sea like melons along a canal. Unimaginable carnage.
Which brings us to the aftermath, the city's ordeal. Mehmed allowed 3 days of plunder.
Yes, standard practice, unfortunately. According to the customs of war at the time, a city that resisted to the end was given over to the victorious soldiers for 3 days of looting. It was seen as their right, their reward.
And the destruction was immense.
Widespread. Streets filled with blood, systematic looting, horrific violence, houses ransacked, women and children raped, terrible accounts of impalement, churches destroyed, icons torn down, precious books ripped apart. The imperial palace at Blachernay left in ruins. Even the city's most sacred icon, the Hodiketria, believed painted by St. Luke, was cut into pieces, destroyed. A profound cultural and religious loss.
Did Mehmed himself react to the destruction?
Apparently so. By June 2nd, just a few days later, he rode through his new city and reportedly found it mostly deserted, half ruined. Churches desecrated, houses uninhabitable. He was famously said to have been moved to tears, saying, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." Hints at his ambition. He wanted a thriving capital, not just a ruin.
There seem to be different accounts of how brutal it was.
Yes, there are contrasts. The Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, suggests Mehmed tried to prevent a complete sack, estimates maybe only 4,000 Greeks died right after. A Venetian report noted 50 Venetian nobles and over 500 other civilians perished.
But other sources paint a worse picture.
Much worse. Historian David Nicole notes that ordinary people might have been treated better than by the Crusaders in 1204, and maybe less portable wealth was left by then. But many other eyewitness accounts from both sides give horrific details. Sailors and Marines apparently went on a massive looting spree before regular troops established order. Descriptions talk of lamentations and weeping in every house, screaming in the crossroads, groaning of grown men, shrieking of women alongside the looting, enslavement, rape. Raw testimony of deep suffering.
And those who resisted.
Simply slaughtered. Barbaro noted, all through the day the Turks made a great slaughter of Christians through the city. Makarios Melsenos wrote the ground was covered in heaps of corpses. Women, virgins, nuns suffered widespread rape, foul debaucheries. Truly horrific.
And the enslavement.
Huge numbers. Estimates range from 30,000 to 50,000 citizens rounded up, forced into slavery. Eyewitnesses described children taken, slave markets set up, people displayed naked for sale. Chilling phrases like, every tent was filled with handsome boys and beautiful girls, dehumanizing suffering on a massive scale.
Are there personal stories?
Heartbreaking ones. George Francis, the loyal chancellor, wrote how his 3 daughters were taken for the imperial harem. The youngest, 14, died of despair. His 15-year-old son was killed for resisting the Sultan's advances. Inside Hagia Sophia, reports of rape, high-born women stripped, bound, led to a shameful fate.
What about the story of Licus Notaris, the Grand Duke?
Ah, yes. The Byzantine historian Ducas claims Mehmed, supposedly drunk, demanded Notaris hand over his youngest son for his pleasure. Notaris refused, saying he'd rather die, and was executed with his sons. It's a powerful story, but modern researchers question its authenticity. Its similarity to earlier stories designed to demonize rulers makes it suspect. Highlights how we need to be critical, even with contemporary accounts, especially ones with high emotional charge. Discerning fact from potential legend.
So a brutal 3 days, but then Mehmed stopped it.
Yes. On the 3rd day, showing his pragmatic side again, he ordered all looting to cease.
And invited people back.
Issued a proclamation, inviting Christians who'd escaped capture or been ransomed to return home without fear. Though, as Francis noted, many had no homes left or were still captive. The Sultan celebrated his victory, proclaimed freedom for those hiding, even promised restoration of homes and property for those who'd fled earlier. It shows that shift from brutal conquest to the strategic goal of rebuilding, repopulating his new capital. A ruined city served no long-term purpose.
Okay, so looking back now, centuries later, what are the big echoes of this fall? The legacy, the impact?
Immense. First, the fall of Constantinople marked the effective, symbolic end of the Roman Empire, an entity that lasted nearly 1,500 years. Gone.
A major dividing line in history?
For many historians, yes. This event signaled the end of the medieval period, the beginning of the early modern era, a fundamental shift.
And militarily?
A massive turning point. Those formidable Theodosian walls, the symbol of defense for centuries, were decisively beaten by gunpowder, Ottoman cannons and bombards. It ushered in a whole new era of siege warfare. Traditional stone walls were suddenly vulnerable.
Leading to new defenses.
Exactly. Led directly to things like the star forts across Europe, designed specifically to withstand artillery. Changed warfare forever.
And for the Ottomans?
Solidified their dominance. Conquest of Constantinople gave them firm control of the Balkans, a springboard for more conquests into Europe, a push that continued until the Battle of Vienna in 1683. They became this unchallengeable power straddling Europe and Asia.
And Mehmed's title?
Fascinating. Recognizing the history, he immediately declared himself Kaiser Arum, Caesar of the Romans.
Claiming the Roman legacy.
Explicitly. Blending Islamic and Roman imperial traditions. An audacious claim that would later clash with others, like the Russians, who also claimed Byzantine heritage. Complex questions of lineage, authority, power that echoed for centuries.
How did Europe react at the time?
Profound shockwaves. Seen as utterly catastrophic, many feared their own kingdoms would be next. Deep dread.
What did they propose doing?
2 main responses, often conflicting. One was a call for a new crusade, pushed hard by Pope Pius II, who lamented the attack on our own land, framing it as an assault on Christendom.
And the other response?
More pragmatic, dialogue, even cooperation with the Ottomans, supported by figures like Nicholas of Cusa. But ultimately, despite the alarm, no major European powers were willing or able to launch a big crusade. They were too exhausted, too divided. The age of crusading was fading.
Did any Byzantine territory survive?
For a short while, the fortress of Mistras in the Peloponnese, ruled by Constantine's feuding brothers, held out until 1460, and the independent empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea fell in 1461. The last embers finally extinguished.
What happened to Constantine's family, since he died without heirs?
His deceased older brother's sons were actually taken into Mehmed's palace service, a glimpse into the new Ottoman elite.
Really? What happened to them?
The older boy, renamed Murad, became a favorite of the Sultan, rose to be governor-general. The younger, Mehdi Pasha, eventually became admiral of the Ottoman fleet, even Grand Vizier. Shows how former imperial heirs could find new, powerful roles, often converting to Islam. The old absorbed into the new.
But maybe the biggest impact was intellectual, the Renaissance connection.
Arguably, yes. A crucial, far-reaching impact was the migration of Byzantine scholars and émigrés to the West, especially Italy. This had started earlier, but intensified dramatically after 1453.
Bringing knowledge with them.
Invaluable knowledge. Documents, ancient Greek texts, philosophy, science preserved in Byzantium for centuries. This direct infusion of learning is widely seen as a key catalyst for Renaissance humanism and science. Many scholars agree it marked the end of the Middle Ages, the real start of the Renaissance, a knowledge transfer that literally reshaped Western thought.
What about the Greeks who stayed in Constantinople?
Many settled in specific districts, like Phanar and Galata. They became known as the Phanariotes. Over time, these educated, often wealthy Greeks became influential advisors, administrators for the Ottoman rulers. A vital bridge between Christian and Muslim worlds, shows how culture and knowledge can adapt, persist, even thrive under new rule.
Culturally and religiously, the legacy was profound too, especially for Eastern Christians.
Absolutely. They were now under Muslim Ottoman rule. Pope Pius II, like many, feared systematic persecution, though Mehmed's policies were often more pragmatic than purely ideological.
And the legends.
So many enduring legends grew out of the siege. We mentioned the eclipse, the strange light over Hagia Sophia. There's the one about two priests vanishing into the cathedral walls with the holy chalice, only to reappear when the city becomes Christian again.
And the marble emperor.
Right. The legend where an angel turned Constantine into marble, hid him underground to await a future Christian return. These myths show the deep psychological, spiritual impact on the collective memory.
Even Tuesday became unlucky for Greeks.
Apparently so. May 29th, 1453 was a Tuesday. Ever since, it's been considered an unlucky day by many Greeks, a somber echo.
And the city's name, Istanbul.
A fascinating journey. The Ottomans initially used Kusenia from the Greek. Folk versions like Islambol, full of Islam, emerged, maybe linked to Mehmed. But Istanbul likely came from the common Greek phrase Iston Polin, meaning to the city, which is how people referred to going there. That only became the official name in 1930. Layers of history in the name itself.
How was the news received in the Islamic world?
Like wildfire. Huge jubilation. Cairo is decorated. The Sharif of Mecca hailed Mehmed as the one who has aided Islam, celebrating what many saw as the fulfillment of a prophecy by the Prophet Muhammad centuries earlier. A massive religious and political triumph.
And at final chilling detail, Constantine's head.
Yeah, the account of a severed head, claimed to be Constantine's, shown to Mehmed. He reportedly declared before it, "Fellow soldiers, this one thing was lacking. Now, we have the riches of the Greeks, we have won their empire, and their religion is completely extinguished." A stark, chilling statement from the conqueror's perspective.
Russia.
The finality of the fall.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together. The fall of Constantinople. It wasn't just a battle, it was seismic, a world-changing event.
Absolutely. It reverberated through history, marked the definitive end of an ancient empire, the dramatic rise of a new global power, the Ottomans, fundamentally reshaped the map, the culture of Europe and the Islamic world.
And the story itself. From Mehmed's brilliance and ambition to Constantine's incredibly valiant but doomed defense. It's this profound clash of civilizations, a showcase of military innovation, and just powerful human drama on an epic scale.
And what's really compelling, I think, is seeing how those ancient, seemingly unbeatable fortifications finally met their match against new technology, gunpowder.
Right, forcing everyone to rethink warfare.
Totally. And we see how geopolitical calculations and huge miscalculations shaped destinies, and how paradoxically, even in the midst of such brutal conflict, the flow of knowledge could actually spark new eras like the Renaissance across a whole continent.
So reflecting on all this today, what does it mean for us? What lessons can we take from the fall of a city once thought invincible?
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe it teaches us something about the fragility of power, even power that seems permanent.
And about human resilience.
Definitely. The persistence of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. And also maybe about how history gets written, shaped by victors, shaped by specific viewpoints, how narratives can be factual but also filled with enduring legends, contested details, even centuries later.
A lot to think about. What stands out most vividly to you from this deep dive?